Have you ever fired someone for attitude or performance issues and found the person totally shocked when you did it? The person was visibly shaken, crying, or obviously upset because you came out of a place of total surprise? If this has happened to you, this unfortunately is the norm, but make no mistake. You have totally failed in your responsibilities of dealing with humans, and it is you who should be fired, especially if it happens regularly. You have totally failed and do not qualify to be a Manacoach. So we thought before we discuss how to fire someone, it would be better to review why the Manacoach rarely has to fire anyone. Here's what any expert who knows anything about human performance agrees on. When there is a performance issue, you have a 90% chance that the employee is not clear on your expectation. It's that simple. So it's the primary role of a Manacoach to identify expectations and address them immediately when they aren't being met. When we work with Manacoaches who have a performance issue with employees, our first question is, do they know what is expected of them? If the answer from the Manacoach is yes, we ask to see them. In other words, are they written down somewhere? We divide expectations into two categories. Regular expectations, where when employees are not meeting them, you are not prepared to fire them. And critical expectations, where employees will not be working for you much longer if the expectation is not met. Critical expectations are company-wide and change depending on the position. For example, arriving on time at your workstation for people doing data input might not be a critical expectation. It's not critical because you aren't prepared to fire them if they arrive late, but they won't be considered for positions where it is a critical expectation. Not the same for someone like the counter salesperson. Being at your workstation on time is a critical expectation because customers are arriving and calling in. A critical expectation for the counter salesperson means they don't have a future with the company in that position if they don't meet the critical expectation. So let's pretend you have a counter salesperson who arrives late all the time, and we'll call her Jane. You have a choice. You can get upset over this behavior and go stew in your office and think up more things you don't like about Jane until you've had enough. Then you call her into your office and fire her. She's upset, she's shocked, and she's crying because she didn't realize that it was such an issue. You had never brought it up before. You think you had brought it up in the past, but what she heard was what she thought were a couple of casual remarks about improvement. Unfortunately, and what is sad in most companies, is that this example is more the norm. The norm because the manager completely failed to have the fortitude, courage, decency, and self-respect to do what the true Manacoach does. The true Manacoach knows that she holds people's lives in her hands. She rarely has to fire anybody. In this scenario, she calls Jane into her office when she realizes that Jane is habitually late. She says to her, "Jane, in your position, being 5 minutes early, ready to answer phones and greet customers at the counter is a critical expectation." She would ask Jane why she was late to explore reasonable logistical reasons. If there weren't any, she would make it clear that being on time is a critical expectation, which means she will not be here long term if this expectation is not met. She gives Jane at least 3 examples where she is not meeting the expectation. She asks Jane if she understands, and asks her if there are any legitimate reasons why this critical expectation cannot be met. She makes a date where she is going to review this in the future to see what progress has taken place. She tells Jane that she will receive a follow-up letter reviewing this discussion. She then finishes the conversation with all the things she admires about Jane and why she is confident that Jane can do what is required to meet this expectation. This was the first step of a 2-step procedure, where the first step of having the meeting is a waste of time if the second step is ignored. The second step is putting it in writing and delivering it. This is not difficult because the Manacoach writes the letter before the meeting so that her mind is focused on the issues, the examples, and the plan to achieve the expectation during the meeting. The Manacoach knows the letter must be delivered within a couple of days after the meeting that reviews the conversation, the critical expectations, the seriousness of meeting the expectation, and a deadline for Jane to respond in person if there's anything she doesn't agree with or understand about the conversation. The Manacoach finishes the letter with something like, "Jane, if I don't hear from you by next Friday, June 22nd, I will assume that you clearly understood what was discussed and what you need to do to continue in your current position." The Manacoach understands how important the letter is and delivers it personally because she knows that if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. The Manacoach also knows that just because it was said, it doesn't mean it is interpreted the same way. People can hear things that are different than what you are saying, especially when they are being criticized. The letter is not written to cover one's back or because there is a lack of trust in the relationship. It is simply written for clarity. Often, the Manacoach is not surprised when Jane returns shortly after receiving the letter because she didn't understand the severity of the situation. or exactly what needed to be done to meet the expectation. The Manacoach knows that all research findings indicate that 85% of the time, and in our data 95% of the time, the employee will either meet the expectation or resign. That's right. When the Manacoach follows this procedure 85 to 95% of the time, it's not necessary to fire the employee. No stress emotionally, and no severance financially. In the rare event where the Manacoach has to fire Jane, she has someone in the room with her and makes the meeting short. The Manacoach gives Jane what's owing for back pay, holidays, etc., a letter outlining severance, and a release that was approved by legal. It's important to note that there is no check for severance at this point. She tells Jane to take time to review the release with others and send it back signed, and then the severance will be paid. There is nothing left to discuss. Unless Jane doesn't get it, she is not surprised. In fact, she might shake hands, and the Manacoach has a clear conscience because she did everything she could. If this seems surreal to you, just try it and tell us what happens. Tough conversations are called tough for a reason, but the Manacoach looks fear in the eyes and has those critical conversations. There are no words to describe the joy when you observe increased health and accountability in cultures, because the Manacoaches are constantly and professionally addressing performance issues in a timely and professional manner. For more information, go to www.themiraclemanager.com.